Peter, there is so much to read over you. Clinical psychologist and systemic family therapist, supervisor and seminar leader, leadership psychologist, introduced nonviolent resistance, New Authority, as an innovative systemic therapy and pedagogical approach in the UK 20 years ago. Is it right? 20 years? 23, I think. Yeah. You work intensively with multi-stressed families and traumatized children and young people and have combined NVR with narrative and solution-focused therapy. It's right, yeah. I remember with great fun your reflection on integrating the voice of children in the conference in Osnabrück here in 2012. It was the first lecture for this, I think. I remember an important topic at that time for the discussion. I'm so happy that, I'm so happy that you are here and that I can listen in your thoughts and considerations. I really love it that you are here. Thank you very much.
Okay. So, is this right? So, good morning, guten Morgen, goeiemorgen. And then I thought in the local language, moin. So, which I've learned you can say at any time of the day, which is very bizarre. You see someone at 10 at night and they say moin, which is, okay. So, I spoke with a colleague yesterday in the hallway, and we talked about putting the R back into NVR, the resistance back into nonviolent resistance. And I remember Martin Luther King saying, "No justice, no peace." So this will be the theme. And what does justice mean therapeutically or in counseling or consultation or pedagogical contexts? So that's just sort of to set the scene, as it were, because the principles in NVR, they were derived from sociopolitical struggles. I'm thinking of Dan Dahlberger's formulation of what constitutes NVR. What is NVR? And he said, resisting harm together in a caring way. Resisting harm together in a caring way, not just caring. And I think that aspect, that we resist harm in a caring way, of course, makes it suitable for parenting. And that is where, at first, nonviolent resistance parent coaching was developed. So, but I'd like to make a distinction between NVR and New Authority. And Martin, for example, Martin Feller and I had a long discussion many years ago whether this should be called nonviolent resistance or New Authority. And we, in a very civilized manner, agreed to disagree. I think both concepts are of value. I would see New Authority as setting a certain framework and directing our attention, our focus, to parents, children, and support networks around parents and families. And I would like to assume that there's also a wider framework. There are contexts which are not addressed within that framework. I think of, in English we speak of ACEs, high levels of adverse childhood experiences, which of course emerge from contexts of social injustice. We can think of parents as survivors of childhood and partner abuse. We can think of wider social injustices of racism, of gender. Yeah, there are a lot of people here who experience injustice purely because of their sex. We can think of classism, Yeah, we can think of economic inequality and hardship. We can think of ableism, yeah, the discrimination of people who are disabled, even though the concept of disability is questionable. Is it disability or is it divergence or difference? And only becomes disability because of a lack of a societal accommodation and respect. We can think of LGBTQ issues that are very salient in the discussions currently. We can think of migration. I was asked a question about migration, and then I realized that I've been a migrant several times over in my life, and everyone I am closely related to has been a migrant, is a migrant. I'd sort of forgotten that. We can think of the trauma of political persecution and, to list a few. So my assumption is that we need, in certain circumstances, to pursue justice in those wider contexts in order to enable the emergence and growth of new authority within the family and between supporters and family members. Not always, but we do well to pay attention to and intervene in those contexts in certain circumstances, because otherwise we have certain elephants in the room. I'm very lousy at IT. I wanted to get an elephant here. But then there were only cute elephants on the internet. But the idea of an elephant in the room is like there's this huge elephant, and we all sit there as if it was not there, as if it didn't exist. So what are some of the elephants in the room if we look only at new authority and new authority principles? Well, I can look at this. I don't have to turn around, do I? To my mind, it gave rise to the development of some of the things I've been interested in for a long time, which was trauma-focused NVR, because there is so much trauma. Child-focused NVR, because there is so much adversity that children have experienced. Various kinds of research show that children who practice child-to-parent violence, about 40% of them have experienced high ACEs. So if we don't address that, we have this huge elephant in the room, right? You know, we're talking about child problematic behavior. We're not talking about those children's problematic experiences, which means that by omission, when we think of Paul Watzlawicks, you cannot not communicate. By omission, we run the risk of framing the child as the problem, which could create an injustice. So elephants in the room create injustices. We can think of the parents' trauma. We can think of domestic violence and abuse. We can think of gender inequality. We can think of oppressive practices and dominance and social injustice in the wider system around the family, which we may not observe if we do not talk about it in therapy, in counseling, in parent coaching. Oh, there we go. So I've already spoken to elephant number one, and where we have, if we do not observe that elephant in the room, we are prone to social exclusion. The numbers of permanently excluded children, boys, from mainstream schools in the UK, 3 times as many black children than white children, 5 times as many traveler children. So travelers are Romani and Irish travelers, and we have some New Age travelers as well. Children living in poverty and children at contextual risk. Now, this is really an interesting thing, because if we don't see the elephant in the room, in child protection contexts, professionals may see the parents as a risk to the child. They do not see the wider picture of contextual risk. I don't think in Germany you have that many gangs yet. the UK is riddled with gangs, and where I live, we have what are called county lines. These are lines of gangs reaching out into the province. It's a good business model. Your gang is situated in London, or in Manchester, and in Liverpool, and then you send delegates out into the provinces. Usually they get first-class compartments on trains. They get to stay at good hotels, because there's good funding. It's a good business model. And then they create local chapters into which young people who, for whatever reason, may be vulnerable, are groomed. The elephant number 2 in the room, history of childhood abuse of the parent. Now, childhood abuse of the parent is not a necessary condition for child-to-parent violence to emerge. It isn't even a sufficient condition, but it is a common experience that we have in many families. Also, when we think of children who go into foster care or into residential care, stationäre Jugendhilfe, we have many, many histories of parental, the parent's experience of intimate partner abuse, coercive control, violence, and their own abuse in childhood. And we have the re-traumatization of the parent by the child's behavior. So if we don't look at this elephant in the room, it is very hard to understand this process and this dynamic. So we come to elephant number 3 in the room. By the way, I've only designated 3 elephants because at my age you can't remember more than 3 things at one time. So there may be many more elephants. So many elephants that we perhaps cannot move in the room without stepping onto. I saw some real elephants recently, a few months ago when I visited my son in Kampala. Boy, they're scary. They come towards you. They're huge. So we have oppressive social environments as the 3rd elephant in the room, which maybe we do not recognize if we do not ask, if we do not talk about them, if our ears are not attuned to them, if our conceptual framework does not encompass them. In the community and in the neighborhood, I remember in the early days talking to Chaim Omer, and Chaim, who's so optimistic, and people really do what he says, inevitably. And he said, oh, if the parents don't want to talk to the neighbor because they're ashamed, that's not a problem. You tell the parents to go to the neighbor and to tell the neighbor, you may have heard the shouting, you may have heard the screams, we have a problem. And then the neighbors say, oh, is there something I can do to help? And I said to Chaim, where I work, the parents go to the neighbor, there's a high chance that the neighbor says, the word starts with F, off. Okay? So we may have very high levels of aggression, often criminality, often based on the background of socioeconomic deprivation in the neighborhood. But we may also have oppressive practices, in professional networks. This is a holy cow of the elephant in the room. Does that work? Because as professionals, we are meant to accept all professionals, and somehow we're all very polite, particularly in the United Kingdom. We're very polite in the United Kingdom, except if we're not. Sometimes people get very vicious, but that's usually in emails. When they speak to each other, they're always very, very polite. So can we scratch at the practice at professionals? Can we question that? And then we have the intersection of disadvantage and oppressive practices. So why does that matter? Why do these elephants in the room matter? Well, for one thing, it's very hard to move in a room where there are elephants that we do not look at and deal with. So these are all contexts of social injustice. And the question to me is, how do we deal with these contexts within our practices and resistance methods of NVR? Because actually, our clients can possibly resist, also in those contexts, not only resist harmful behavior by the child. And we can help them resist. And NVR offers a methodology for our clients to resist, and our skills develop to support them in those methodologies. And we ourselves can resist. So this question takes us into many dimensions of nonviolent resistance beyond New Authority. But I believe that nonviolent resistance in these wider contexts and New Authority are connected. And I think that is the synthesis of Martin and my discussion of many years ago, because I've pondered that discussion over and over and over again. So why does it matter? Why does social justice, I mean, apart from the fact that social justice matters to many of us in principle, but why does it matter therapeutically? Because injustice continues to traumatize. And re-traumatization causes what some have called trauma cascade within the parents, in the siblings, in the interest child, throughout the family. The family becomes organized into what Arnon Bentham called a trauma-saturated system. Yeah? System, by the way, is not the people. It's not the bodies. System is a communication system that is trauma-organized. And then we have the individualizing of problems if we don't address social injustice. If we don't address social injustice, problems are individualized by us, those of us who are systemically oriented, into the family. The family, we, in the early days of systemic therapy, criticized the individual perspective, where problems were individualized into the mind of the client or patient. But we, I believe, fall foul of contextualizing often the difficulties and individualize them into the interaction of the family. So that gives us several vectors of resistance. Yes, within the New Authority paradigm, resistance to harmful and self-destructive behavior of the child, and connective resistance. Yeah? Resisting together in a caring way, again to quote Dan Dahlberger. But we have aggression and dominance in the nuclear and in the wider family, around the nuclear family. We have aggression and dominance in the social environment, in the wider social environment, in the family, in community, in society, in social media. We have harmful institutional practices. And we have resistance to our own harmful or counterproductive behavior, because it raises the question of where do we position ourselves as practitioners of NVR? So why do we need these vectors of resistance to injustice? Because I believe that resistance to injustice can become a healing agent. Does that make sense? Yeah? Resistance itself changes our state of mind. I think of Chaim Omer talking about if you can get a parent to do something she never thought she could do before, that becomes a transformative experience for the parent. So, rather than, as a child psychiatrist and friend of mine said many years ago, and I started my book with that observation, oh, you can't, I'm referring this family to you because you're the violence guy, aren't you? But you can't do your NVR thing with that. And I said, why? And he said, because this mother is much too traumatized. She needs something else. And I said, I don't know anything else. You know, lest we send her into adult mental health for some trauma therapy with a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year waiting list. Good luck with that one, and whether she ever gets there. Instead, NVR can become a trauma therapy for the parent if we help her resist. There are psychological mechanisms when we shift the narratives, when we shift the narrative from victim to resistor. We think of people as survivors of abuse, but we can also at times think of them as resistors to abuse. And what are the qualities that emerge within a resistor? That is a question. So I think the interventions with NVR become more effective when we coach people to resist. And finally, why does resisting injustice matter? Because it's right. For no other reason that it's right. Parents get better. Usually kids get better. But even if they didn't get better, it's right. This is also a lesson that we can learn from Martin Luther King and others who said that I remember Martin Luther King's last speech, where he said that the Lord has given him the good grace to allow him to go up the mountain and to look beyond into the promised land, which he will not see. And then he was shot the next day and killed. So, I think of NVR as an inclusive orientation. So to be genuinely nonviolent and inclusive of children, so to resist in a caring way, we must create space for the unheard need, voice of need, which Martin addressed when he introduced me, of the traumatized child. And I also believe that our nonviolent resistance needs to move the system and systems towards dialogue. Within the family, dialogue between, what I call the caring dialogue between parent and child, but also dialogue between us, between parents, between other entities and fields of the wider system. But there may not be the opportunity for dialogue yet. And I remember someone asking Chaim, is NVR like nonviolent communication? Is that the same thing or are they similar? And Chaim said, oh, they're very similar. Nonviolent resistance begins where nonviolent communication ends. But I believe that resistance is only truly nonviolent if it attempts to move us towards dialogue. But we mustn't fall to the illusion that dialogue is always possible. I think NVR can kindle caring dialogue between parents and child. What does caring dialogue look like? I think of it as an often implicit dialogue. A teenage boy isn't going to come home and say, hey, Mom, I had a really bad day at school. I walked past this group of girls and they giggled at me. And I blushed, and it felt even worse. And I felt so, he's not going to do that, right?
No, never.
Never. And if he does, we might need to be worried. However, caring dialogue is often implicit by nature. There are coded signals of distress or need, and there are coded implicit responses of care in such a caring dialogue. And the parents in this dialogue feel validated by the child. This is the beef I have with pure attachment theory, that it often does not consider this as a two-way process. The parent is often in certain understandings of attachment theory, I should say. The parent is seen as a kind of reservoir that needs to be filled up, a reservoir where the parent attunes to the child, the parent perhaps mirrors the child, the parent enables the child not to act on their own affect but express themselves, etc., 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 is the safe haven for the child. Yet the parent needs the child's expression of need in order to feel that they matter. And thereby the child validates the parent, so it is a circular process. So how do we rekindle that? We rekindle that in part by helping parents to move out of traumatic victimhood and erasure. Again, what Dan Dahlberger has first coined as erasure. The sense that parents often have of not existing, not mattering, not being there, not being meaningful as parents, or perhaps not being meaningful as individuals. We can sometimes witness parents speaking as if they were their child, yeah? Almost shouting at us, you know. And then actually when we ask, they say, well, that's what my daughter would say to you. But the parent wasn't in the room anymore. The parent's values seem to have become erased. So anyway, we can help the parents move out of trauma, in the big T trauma. We can help them move out of that sense of erasure. And then when they're in a position of strength, then they can provide the anchoring function of attachment to the child. And if it is a child that has been traumatized, the anchoring function of attachment, I think, is in principle the same as always in new authority practices, but the parents go the extra mile if they can. That's very important. Children who've experienced trauma are often either much more anxious and interpret the responses of other people as hostility, or they are much more hostile themselves. They go into flight or fight response quite habitually. So it is not enough with a traumatized child to have a straight face. It is important to generate that extra smile, that extra act of care, and for that extra act of care to be authentic, to be congruent, because if it is not congruent, the child that is sensitized to inauthentic parental responsiveness will smell a rat 1,000 miles off. Yeah? I don't want to discriminate against rats, but... So, how do we do that? How can we help parents get to such a stage? Willem Beckers and I have been working together for many years on developing imaginary and embodied practices to help parents imagine the child validating them, to violate the parent's expectation, negative expectation, that the child will signal that they do not matter. So we help the parents violate their own expectations in their imagination. They can imagine the child engaging in the caring dialogue and validating them. But how do parents get there? Parents who've been abused, who've been disadvantaged. Well, we can use NVR to help them ameliorate their trauma, rather than waiting for the referral to adult mental health. We can use interpersonal embodiment of strength, because we work with supporters, so they can borrow strength from supporters in resisting re-traumatization from the child. And finally, we can use NVR methodologies to oppose the wider system oppression that they may be exposed to, including oppression by professional networks. Those of you who were in Erica Scott and Carrie Shoesmith's workshop yesterday, which I was a bit worried, I think they're taking the wind out of my sails. Such a wonderful workshop. There were many examples of multi-contextual resistance in NVR with the use of different kinds of announcements. How does that work? So one of my greatest heroes, Rosa Parks, whom I trust many, if not most of you, will be familiar with, her badge of honor, the number in her mugshot, after she was arrested for refusing to vacate her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Rosa Parks writes, "I have learned over the years that one's mind is made up." And in NVR, we speak of determination, don't we? "This diminishes fear. Knowing what must be done does away with fear." This is a psychological hypothesis. We're engaged in psychological practices. Something about the process of becoming determined and the realization and an embodied realization of what must be done, which is what we nurture in NVR, diminishes fear, according to Rosa Parks. And boy, did she know something about fear diminishing. So these are parents who are exposed to people in the wider system around them. Yet, if we come back to the elephants in the room, we don't just have nice neighbors who will say, "Oh dear, that's difficult. Is there anything I can do?" We don't just have nice professionals who are open, who take a position of unsafe certainty, often thought of as or referred to as a not knowing position. You know, we don't always have these response patterns. We have often critical and prescriptive response patterns, sometimes more subtle. Any of the men here have had boys referred to him because he needs to be seen by a man? Okay. That is an oppressive practice, generally. Of course, there will be exceptions. But what are the assumptions that underlie the referral of a boy to a man because a woman, therapist, counselor, whatever, would not be able to address his needs? What are the underlying assumptions? I just want to throw it out into the room to think about those. He needs a man. I'm not saying that men cannot play an important role in a boy's life as identification figures. We do want them to grow up to become responsible, decent, just men. Yet, there are questions. We can have people who say, "Honey, I'll talk to her." This is a critical and prescriptive practice. Did you call the police when he trashed the house? Why didn't you? Critical and prescriptive. And what does critical? 10 more minutes. I've only just started. Okay. Then we have dangerous and coercive practices by others. And then we have emotionally safe practices. I'm not saying these people are inherently critical and prescriptive, or even inherently dangerous and coercive. But they position themselves in certain ways, and systems invite people to position themselves in certain ways. If you're familiar with positioning theory, such as formulated by Rom Haré and other social psychologists, we see the effect of positioning of others on the psychological functioning, on the emotional well-being of people. So dominant positioning increases stress levels in the family. It stimulates survival reactivity of the parent and child, and it undermines a parental sense of agency at the intersections of adversity. A little chart, which you can look at in your own time, because I only have 9 more minutes. So I'd like to tell you 2 examples. One is a racist incident, something that happened to a woman in a German city. It could be in any major city in the world. When she was boarding a bus, this is a woman of color, a brown woman of South Asian origin, who was pregnant, heavily pregnant, not very pregnant, heavily pregnant with twins. She had a very, very big belly. When you have twins, you have a big belly. And she was trying to pay her bus fare, and a man pushed her aside angrily. And she said, "Whoa." And he said, "You and the likes of you, you have all these children." Just think of that. And it was the only openly racist incident this woman experienced in her many years living in Germany. But it was an incident that never left her, and which connected with later microaggressions. At one point, one of the twins fell out of his bunk bed because he was trying to be Spider-Man. and suffered a minor skull fracture, and the woman was thrown into a state of panic. What will social services say? And I said, well, you explain to them. And she said, no, but they won't believe me. I said, why do you think they won't believe me? She said, because I'm brown. This woman was the mother of my children. The boy who fell out of the bed is my son, Robin. He's very well, incidentally. Never came to a child protection investigation. But imagine if it did. Imagine the stress on her. Imagine the psychophysiological arousal she experiences chronically, because whenever people looked at her in public, she became somewhat uneasy. And she felt they are looking at her because she is brown. So imagine someone with these experiences in a child protection investigation or working with professionals. And I'd like to speak to you about a case. I'm just finishing up. And this is an announcement. Hold on. I won't show you the announcement yet. This is an example of how the structure of the system creates violence. Structural violence by a provider system of child protection. Because when a child has psychological difficulties, we have no risk. We have no categories of contextual risk in child protection in the United Kingdom. We have neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse. Yeah? We don't have emotional abuse, sorry. We don't have a category contextual risk, right? So how does that direct the professional's attention? Oh, this boy is acting out. There was a machete. People have machetes in the UK. There was a machete in his room. He's involved with county lines, the gangs that I spoke of. He's getting abused. He's getting abused by others, by his parents, of course, because that's what the categories stipulate. So this boy and his little sister, and I won't tell you more about the case, I could tell you very much about it. They were made subject to a child protection plan. Just one little example of something that happened. The little girl has fetal alcohol syndrome. And part of her fetal alcohol syndrome, she is a chatterbox. Plappermaul in German. Maybe even in Dutch, I don't know. Sorry? Babbelkous. Babbelkous. That's a good word. I'll remember that. Babbelkous. So she gets interviewed by the head teacher of the school every week about what happens at home. So the head teacher reports that to social services. And she, Mommy had a glass of wine with Granny. And that led to a report to social services. Social services asked the mother about the glass of wine she had with the grandmother. The mother was upset. The mother told the head teacher that she was upset. The discussion was rather confrontational between the mother and the head teacher, and the mother broke down crying. The head teacher reported to social services that she believes the mother probably has a mental health problem. Social services stipulated that she must have a mental health assessment. By the way, they didn't ask me. I'd been working with a family. I know a little bit about mental health. You know, like 40 years of work in mental health. Because that's interesting, because my voice was sidelined. And there were 2 other dissenting professionals. So we were stonewalled. That's an interesting point. So, of course, the mental health assessment was negative. She was not suffering from a mental health disorder. But the effects, 3 more minutes, the effects of all this on the well-being of the parents, their self-confidence, their sense of agency in dealing with the difficulties arising not only from their son's behavior, but from the threats to the family by an opposing gang, where the opposing gang was terrorizing their son, the neighborhood, and the parents, neighbors having bricks thrown through their windows. Their capacity to deal with that, their capacity to deal effectively and generate new authority was undermined. So the work entailed coaching the parents to resist. And here is their announcement. And I will read it to you, even though you can read it. We appreciate that many of you have invested so much time in supporting our family. In the UK, we write announcements as what's called a shit sandwich. Right? Nice stuff, problems, nice stuff. This is a shit sandwich. Sorry. Some of you have shown that you have the best interests of our children in mind and have put measures in place to help them. I can read here, I keep forgetting. We are often left feeling that we are not fully believed and that some professionals are looking for red flags in our behavior, parenting, and mental health. This has resulted in us feeling that some of you are not working with us as parents in the best interests of all the family. I forgot to mention the father was abused in his own childhood. Some of you are not always working collaboratively with us as parents of adopted, therefore vulnerable children, and there have been situations that feel oppositional. When we say something hasn't happened, it is still believed that it has. And when we have said we do not wish to have a particular assessment because we do not see it as relevant, it is still pushed through. When we say we need something, however, it hasn't always happened or been pursued. This increases pressure on us. We second-guess our decisions related to our parenting. We feel controlled, and our confidence is being eroded. Being perceived as mishandling situations, getting it wrong, is deeply upsetting. Our confidence needs to grow rather than be diminished. We will be questioning. Here's the part of the announcement. We will resist, right? We will be questioning why we have not been believed and asking why, when we have said no to something, it is still pushed through. So we will speak up. We will not remain silent as they had done. When measures are insisted upon that we do not agree with, we will ask that our views are noted in the file. We want to have a happy and healthy shit sandwich. We want to have a happy and healthy working relationship with all of you. This is a preferred future. We want our children to be happy. Devon, to be to be able to return to education, and Chelsea to feel safe at all times in school. Last thought. James, that's the dad, observed that what we need are caring arms around us, supporting us through the difficult times the children are having and, as a result, the challenges we face as parents. From some of you we get this. From others it is clear there is a different agenda being pursued. Do you want to know the happy end? Devon is back in school after 1.5 years or 2 years of absence, including during COVID. He didn't go online to go to school. He's back in school. He's avoiding the county line. He has not been violent. And it was yesterday that I got a text, because I couldn't go to the Child Protection Review Conference, that both children were taken off. They are no longer subject to a child protection plan. And the parents have said that their confidence has been restored, including the confidence of the dad, who has an abuse history, whose confidence is often shaky, who tends at times to lose his self-efficacy, his sense of personal agency. It's been restored, not by virtue of what the local authority has done different in response to them, but by virtue of announcing, we will resist. Okay. So, and I can't talk to you about Sarah, but you can read about a client of mine, an adult, because my idea is that this can extend to any form of psychological therapy and counseling, including when we work therapeutically with adults who've been traumatized, where, when necessary, we can help them to develop a resistor narrative and become resistors on the basis of NVR practices. And I've written about it in a German book, Handbuch der narrativen Praxis, that Arist and I and others co-edited. And I've written about it in Context magazine 2021, an article together with Sarah, together with the client, of her journey into becoming a resistor. Okay, thank you.